Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session of Speaking Out About History, our author interview series with the Sons of the American Revolution. Today, we are very happy to have Jim Stempel, the author of The Enemy Harassed, who's going to talk to us today about his book. Jim was born in Westfield, New Jersey in 1948, graduated from the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina in 1970 with a degree in political science. He is married and the father of three. He and his wife, Sandy, live in Western Maryland, overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains near Sharpsburg and the Antietam battlefield. A student of the human condition, Jim works span a range including satire, spirituality, and military nonfiction. He is considered an authority on the Eastern campaigns of the American Civil War, and his books on that topic have drawn an international audience. His first novel, American Rain, was hailed by critics and labeled a masterpiece by the West Coast Review of Books. His novel, Albemarle, was nominated for the James Fenimore Cooper Prize in Historical Fiction. He's written 3 books on the American Revolution: American Hannibal, the extraordinary account of Revolutionary War hero Daniel Morgan at the Battle of Cowpens; Valley Forge to Monmouth, 6 transformative months of the American Revolution; and his latest, the topic of today's Speaking Out About History interview, and his 10th published book, The Enemy Harassed, Washington's New Jersey Campaign of 1777. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Jim Stempel. Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brooks. Appreciate it very much. I'd like to talk a little bit before we get into your questions and all about the book, about why I decided to write it and why I found it so interesting, why I think a lot of your members and the public at large would find it very interesting. Like you said, I was born and raised in central New Jersey. I live in Maryland now, but I had never learned much of anything about this period of time during the Revolutionary War. Yet I was, as a young man, very much interested in history and all those attendant things. We had learned a lot, or we had been told a lot about the revolution in Westfield, my hometown. A lot of those things turned out to be lore more than fact as I started researching this book. Initially, I was asked to take a look at this period and maybe write a book about it. That fascinated me because I didn't think much had happened in New Jersey during this period of time. The more and more I looked at it, the more fascinated I became. This is one of the most excited times I've ever had to write a book, because I really discovered something that I thought I didn't know, a lot of people didn't know about, and yet was extremely important. I mean, this is a 7-month, 8-month period during the Revolutionary War that's never really been touched upon in general, overall, in other words. And how do you find something like that? I mean, the Revolutionary War, like the Civil War, has been picked over by historians for 250 years, the Revolutionary War, and yet nobody's taken a hard look at this. It was hard to believe. One of the things I found was that the entire British Army at one point in time marched into my hometown of Westfield, 16,000 strong in 2 divisions, destroyed the town, tore it to shreds, ran off with all the livestock, much of the money, and I had never even heard about that. That's when I really knew, okay, I'm on to something here that nobody really knows about. So I started doing a lot of hard research about the book at that point in time. It took me a while, but what we came up with, what we found was that during this period of time, the British Army suffered about 3,300 casualties, and we compared that to the campaign they had in New York in 1776, when they suffered about 1,500 casualties. Now, the New York campaign is extremely well known, but the New Jersey campaign is hardly known at all. And yet they suffered twice as many casualties or more. And that 3,300 number is probably a very low number to begin with. So you had to ask yourself, I had to ask myself, well, how did this happen? How did nobody know about this during this period of time? Or how did we not know about it now when the British suffered so much? Well, then what I found out was that after going through everything we could, was that there were a good 132 engagements fought in central New Jersey during this period of time. They were large and they were small, but 132 engagements is a lot of engagements. So you can start to make sense now about what was happening. There was a lot of fighting, but there weren't any major battles. Most of those engagements have no particular names or anything like that. So it was just constant fighting almost over a long period of time that drained the British Army. And then we can start to take a look at, well, why did this occur? And the reason it occurred is that after Washington's 10 crucial days, after he won at Trenton and won at Princeton, he moved into central New Jersey to go into winter quarters. Now, as you probably know, the Continental Congress had arranged the Continental Army in terms of establishments. And the second establishment, which was on board in the Continental Army between January 1st, 1776 to the end of December 1776, marched off. Their enlistments were over at the end of December. So that second establishment had marched off as Washington's moving into central New Jersey. Now, Congress had set up a third establishment as well, but they were yet to arrive. So as Washington moved into central New Jersey, his army was going in the opposite direction. And so he had to wait and hold things together until the third establishment of the army arrived and he could fight with them. At one point in time, we found a return on the Continental Army. I think it was in early March, where he had 2,200 Continentals, and that was all across all of New Jersey, whereas Howe and Cornwallis at the time in New Brunswick had about 18,000 troops. So he was highly undermanned when it came to fighting. So during this period of time, he could not fight a major battle. He had no capacity to do so. And he was essentially scared to death that the British would find out how undermanned he was. So they set up a string of forward posts around New Brunswick, which is where the British consolidated at the time after Princeton, after Washington's victory at Princeton. They consolidated around New Brunswick, which was along the Raritan River, which ran out into the Atlantic Ocean. And around that, the Americans set up some militia posts and continental posts. Most of these were movable feasts. Men were moving in and moving out all the time. None of them were large. Most of them were maybe 1,000 men to 500 men. And the point was to really to keep an eye on the British and to challenge them should they come into New Jersey and give Washington forewarning so that he could move if necessary. And for the first 3 months of the year, there were hot contests all along those boundaries between the British in New Brunswick and the American posts. The British during this period of time were trying to get into central New Jersey to get forage for their animals by and large, and they were being attacked at almost every time they made a movement. To begin with, they were coming out in small groups and they were being attacked by militias. Later, they were coming out in large groups with a lot of men. In fact, Cornwallis led one of these foraging expeditions into a town that's now called New Brunswick, but it was called Wiggletown back then, of thousands of troops just to see if they could get forage for their animals. This period is called the Forage War, really the first 3 months of the winter in New Jersey during 1777. Now, what was going on is even if the British were successful in getting forage for their animals, they were taking casualties every single day. So you had small parties going out all over the place, some large parties going out, and they were being attacked on a daily basis. And that's why their casualty rate was going up and through the roof. Like I said, there were 132 engagements during this period of time. And the Americans were inflicting a lot of damage on the British. And over a period of time, General Howe decided he realized that he could not march across New Jersey, or he certainly couldn't stay in New Jersey. His army was being bled to death. So he had to make a decision on what to do. And he wanted to go, he couldn't get Washington to fight him in a straight up fight. Washington wasn't about to do that. He knew it would be suicidal, did not have the manpower. So in April and May, Howe made a decision. He wanted to move his army south and attack Philadelphia, which was then the American capital. The decision he had to make was whether he could march across New Jersey successfully, or he had to take his entire army out to sea and land at south and march up on Philadelphia. And what he discovered over a period of time was that he had no chance to march across New Jersey, his army would have been eaten alive, and when he arrived there, he would have been undermanned to do the job. So Washington was able to successfully save his army during this period of time, allow it to grow into the June and summer months, and then drive Cornwallis and Howe out of New Jersey, which was an amazing strategic success for an army that was completely undermanned at the beginning of the winter, and then by the end of that period of time had started to come back. The third establishment was starting to arrive, and he was gaining strength again. So that's basically what the book is about. I think that Washington went in with those two objectives: have his army survive during this period of time, and hopefully drive the British out of New Jersey. And he was successful at both.
All right. Well, thank you. That's a great overview of the period. You know, in listening to and having read the book, I see some parallels to Washington's strategy of posts to the British earlier strategy of establishing outposts and dispersing his forces. However, Washington didn't have to deal with a hostile militia in his rear as he established his posts and kind of tried to contain the British, whereas the British were fighting a different scenario as it evolved. So thank you. Let's get into some of the questions from membership. The first question I'd like to ask comes from Terry Sater of the Wisconsin Society. And Terry asks, do you see any parallels between how the Continental Army fought the British in New Jersey and how the Ukrainian army is fighting the Russians today?
That's a good question. I'm no expert on the Ukrainian army, but there are certain parallels between the two situations. The Ukrainians are fighting a greatly overwhelming army that invaded their land, is causing a lot of what we call today war crimes almost. The people are fighting for their lives, for their farms, for their livelihoods. There's a lot of similarities between that and in the winter in 1777 in New Jersey. During the latter part of 1776, after the New York campaign, the British marched through New Jersey following Washington's army down to the Delaware River. And during that period of time, they raided a lot of homes, destroyed a lot of farms, beat up a lot of men, hung men, shot men, raped women. They turned large areas, large swaths of New Jersey into wasteland, literally. And that wasn't forgotten by the people of New Jersey. It wasn't across the entire state, but it did enough to make a lot of people just furious with the British and what they were doing to them, what they had done to them. New Jersey was at the time a very peaceful agrarian area of prosperous farms and prosperous farmers. And this wasn't forgotten. And as the British marched and did this, and they had an attitude of utter superiority, I think that the militias and the people of New Jersey really responded to this with great fury and great anger. And by the end of the British occupation of New Jersey in 1777, it was the people and the militias as much as Continentals that drove them out. The British were getting shot at from behind barns and trees and rocks all over the place, and sometimes those were just normal citizens that were doing the firing. So the parallels are somewhat similar, although what's going on in Ukraine is by orders of magnitude worse, I think. But for the time period, the British really stepped on the people of New Jersey, and they got it back in return.
Thank you, Jim. That leads to our second question. This one comes from Shane James of the International Society. It's related to your answer to that previous question. Why do you think the British cared so little about civil affairs and their relationships with the local population?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. It does go back to the other one. I think the British senior staff in particular, they were all nobles. They were of the same family structure and so forth. I think they had European attitudes. I think they considered the American people, certainly the American farmers, peasants, and they had a low regard for peasants. But the Americans didn't consider themselves peasants. They were free farmers. They were prosperous people, and they had lived like that for quite some time. And so the British had an attitude towards the Americans that was highly, they looked down upon the Americans, and the Americans took umbrage at that, quite frankly. I think the British greatly misread the people they were fighting. They thought that they were infinitely superior when it came to their armies, their weaponry, and their knowledge of warfare. Probably true to begin with, but that didn't mean that the Americans couldn't learn and wouldn't fight back hard. I think it was all an attitude, in honesty. During this period of time, Howe issued a proclamation allowing the people of New Jersey to come in and sign an oath, and they would get protection from the crown and so forth. And a lot of people did that, but they didn't get the protection. They were still being attacked. They were still being hassled by the Hessians and the British regulars. And so after a while, they realized the British weren't going to help them, and they weren't going to protect them in any way. And so they drove a lot of the people of New Jersey, the citizens, away from what their objectives were, which was to pacify the region. And they really turned it into a hornet's nest instead by their attitudes and their actions.
All right, thank you. Yeah, it's a severe miscalculation, I think. You talk about parallels in American history and the winning hearts and minds, and at the period where it was in doubt, the New Jersey civilian population was rallying to signing statements of loyalty to the crown. And the British had an opportunity, I think, to pacify the local civilian population and play that, but they failed miserably.
Well, and let me just also point out that George Washington understood this from beginning to end. He knew that the war could never be won without the support of the people. And initially, when he was in New Jersey, he was very upset with New Jersey militias, not all of them, but a lot of them. And he considered them basically using the war to attack their neighbors and ransack their homes and do things like that. He realized that the war could never be won, never, if the people were going to be upset with the American cause. And he took that out hard on his troops if he caught them doing that, whereas the British could care less, quite frankly. And people realized it after a while, who had their interests at heart and who didn't.
Very true. And yeah, I think one of the parallels that you can draw from all of this is that George Washington was not a military professional, but he learned and he internalized his lessons learned, and you could see him grow over time as both a military commander and as a commander-in-chief. Given that George Washington could internalize these lessons and learn from them and do better the next time, why did the British fail so miserably at La Petite Guerre, or the small wars in the Jerseys? And why didn't they incorporate lessons learned from their early failures in their future operations, particularly in the South?
Well, I think, Brooks, for the same reason. I think that they were indifferent. I think that they had an attitude, and this is my opinion. I've read a lot about it, and you try to reason why did they do these things. I think they just felt like they were going to win this war, and that's all there was to it. It was impossible for them to lose, and that they didn't have to change. They didn't have to incorporate new attitudes or ideas about how to go about fighting a war. Whereas Washington, you're right, he was learning every day, and he was trying to learn. I can give you an excellent example of that from my book. One of the things I learned there, it was in early April of 1777. The roads had dried, the snows had melted, and Cornwallis decided to attack a small town, a village where the Americans had about 500 men stationed, called Boundbrook. It was just 8 miles away from New Brunswick, right up the Raritan River. 2 roads ran there. Overnight, he brought 4,000 troops on nighttime in 4 different wings to converge on Boundbrook in the morning. It was a beautifully done, successful attack. They ran the Americans off probably in 15 to 20 minutes, captured about 80 of them, shot a few of them, and then marched off. Now, I was looking at the map of Boundbrook, and I can't tell people exactly how this was, but Boundbrook sat on the right flank of the American forward line of positions, and New Brunswick, fronted them, and roads ran from Boundbrook north and west behind all the American positions. Now, if Cornwallis had just simply looked at his map, and I know he knew the map, he would have realized that he held his troops at Boundbrook and sent a column of maybe 2,000 or 3,000 additional troops, many of which he had. He had 18,000 at New Brunswick, behind the American lines up those roads. I'm fairly convinced that those American positions would have been abandoned almost immediately, because they would have become untenable. They would have been front on the flank, front, and rear. They would have been cut off from Washington, and they would have fled. It was there for the taking. It was simple. All he had to do was look at the map. But I don't think he ever cared about looking at the map. I don't think he cared about a victory like this. I think they felt like they were going to win the war. They didn't have to do anything special. But George Washington saw what happened at Boundbrook, and within days wrote to William Maxwell, one of his generals, and said essentially, we need to do some things here. We need to pull our troops together. We need to have scouts out in front of our people. We can't allow for surprises like this anymore. And then within about 3 weeks, he wrote to Benjamin Rush and told Benjamin Rush he was going to move his army up to the first ridge line of the Watchung Mountains into a fairly impregnable position. And he wrote Rush and said, an army that's concentrated can attack faster, can defend faster, can supply its men faster, can do a whole number of things. A lot of these are what we now call the principles of war, right? And Washington seemed to get them almost from seeing what happened at Boundbrook, and the possibilities of what the British could do him and what they did do to him. And he digested all that and made the necessary changes. The British didn't change at all. I mean, they attacked Boundbrook and took Boundbrook at dawn. It took the Americans something like 7 or 8 hours to reinforce Boundbrook. By the time they reinforced Boundbrook, the British had already turned around and marched back to New Brunswick. So you would think that Cornwallis or somebody in the British High Command would have said, isn't that interesting? It took them 8 hours to reinforce a command. Maybe we can use that to our benefit. But they never did. I just think they were utterly indifferent. I think that they thought they were going to win no matter what. And it didn't require a great deal of thought. They could beat these provincials. We don't have to stress ourselves or overly think it. I think that was their attitude. And they displayed it over and over again. And they certainly did it again in the South. You're right. I have read a lot, and I wrote a book about the war in the South, in South Carolina. And they won Charleston. They took Charleston. They beat Horatio Gates at Camden horribly. The South was completely open to them, and they did the same thing. They turned it into basically a hornet's nest by abusing the people, and they turned the people against them. It got to the point where a British courier could not ride across South Carolina without being shot out of his saddle. They did the same exact thing. They did not respond to what was going on. Cornwallis had it in his head that there were these legions of loyalists that were going to march to his flag at some point in time. They never appeared because either one, they were cowed by the people who were for the revolution, or else they didn't exist.
Very, very true. And arrogance is never a good trait in a general or an organization in the field. You mentioned the consolidation of the army at Watchung and the correspondence with Benjamin Rush. There were arguments both for and against consolidating the Army. One of the arguments against consolidating the Army was potential for disease, camp fever, the bloody flux, some of the different horrendous things that could strike a camp. One of the worst was smallpox. One of our questions from the outreach education staff is, did Washington's decision to inoculate the Continental Army beginning in February have any effect on the New Jersey campaign?
Yeah, I would believe it did. I've read a lot about the war prior to that and during this period and after that. And I'd have to say, I read a lot of diaries and things like that. And there was no mention of smallpox, like there was in other periods during the New York campaign in particular. I did not, and until somebody brought that up in your question, I didn't think about it. But no, I did not see any mention of smallpox. Now, there were other problems, dietary problems and things like that, because they didn't have the proper foods over the winter and that sort of thing. But I think it was a great idea and it seemed to work. And I saw no real mention of smallpox raging through the Army at all. I know Benjamin Rush didn't want to move early into to consolidate the Army early, but Washington felt, I think he was right. He knew that the British were going to be on the move and he couldn't really resist them. And so it's kind of like choose your poison, right? I can move into the hills and be protected there and try to take care of my men. And if they get sick, they get sick. Or I could lose them on the flatlands of New Jersey. I think it was a good decision, and I don't recall that there were any big outbreaks of anything in the Middlebrook encampment.
One of the great things about your book is the number of primary sources and the diaries and real-time correspondence of the primaries, the people who were involved in the actual war, and were writing about their day-to-day experiences. Next question comes from Bryce Terry of the International Society. And it says, in your research, which of the new primary sources you found was the most interesting or impactful to the story, and why?
I found a diary from, I think his name was John Peoples, who was a British soldier. A very, very well written, very good book. I loved the journal of Johann Ewald from the Hessian perspective. I got the impression he was a very honest man. Of course, he was writing it also years after the fact, I think, and so he knew who won and who didn't win. But I got a very good impression from him. I'm trying to think. I read a biography, or not a biography, a book about my own hometown that I thought was fabulous, written in the 19th century, that gave me a lot of information about the overall general area. A book about the Battle of Bolingbroke, again written in the 19th century. There was a lot of information I uncovered I didn't know that much about. A whole smattering of diaries. I wrote it basically 2 years ago. Can't remember them all, but they gave a lot of interesting perspectives, different attitudes. Again, there were British officers who did seem to get that, who were fighting daily, who did seem to get the idea that, you know what we're doing here? We're training these guys in how to fight. Instead of going out and beating them hard, we're giving them daily instruction in how to fight. And Brooks, probably that attitude and belief in yourself in battle is probably as much as anything. I mean, prior to the war, they probably thought the British troops were 10 feet tall. Now they're going toe to toe with them, and in many occasions, getting the better. And so the Americans came out of it. Their low line officers getting a lot of experience. The men themselves getting a lot of experience in how to fight. And so, to a certain extent, it was a tutorial given by the British on how to fight that really helped the Americans. And I got the impression that a lot of young, lower level British officers were seeing that, because they were the ones having to go out daily and fight this fight. And they didn't necessarily have this attitude that oh, we're going to win, don't worry about it, which is kind of the attitude I took from Howe and Cornwallis. I mean, Howe was basically happy living his life in New York City at the time, enjoying himself, and letting Cornwallis run the daily operations of the army. So they were definitely intellectually and physically apart from what was going on.
Our next question comes from Jacob Vink of the Indiana Society. And Jacob asks or says, during your interview on the Revolutionary War Rarities podcast, which, by the way, guys, if you haven't seen that, it's actually very well done. It's a good interview. During your interview on the Revolutionary War Rarities podcast, you mentioned that you were astonished that the winter of 1777 was an 8-month period of the war that was almost unknown. Given the importance of the events of early 1777, why do you think this period has been so often overlooked in popular history?
Yeah, a great question. I mean, that to me was almost the question when I started coming across a lot of this material. I almost had to step back and say to myself, am I right here? Is this really true? Am I write this book and say this is an eight-month period that's not known? And I had to really think about it long and hard. And then I had to think about, well, if I'm right, then why is this right? I think that there are three basic reasons as to probably why this was not well known at all. Number one, it took place over winter, and I think it was pretty harsh winter in New Jersey. I got the impression that there were a lot of heavy snowstorms just from the diaries I was reading. And European armies tended not to fight in the winter just due to the conditions. They went into winter quarters. So I don't think a lot of things were expected out of this period of time. Washington went into winter headquarters. His headquarters was up in the mountains. It was a small little removed headquarters. That's one of the reasons. The next reason is that there were no major battles fought during this period, like we've discussed before. There was a lot of constant fighting, but there were no major battles. There was no Brandywine. There was no Saratoga. There was nothing like that would make huge headlines everywhere across the country. And so there was stuff in the Philadelphia papers and New York papers, and I read a lot of that stuff. But it was the same old thing. It was, today our guys, a regiment under so and so hit some Hessians here and there. They fought for 3 or 4 hours and backed off, and there were 20 casualties. It was all small-time stuff. Nothing that would have stirred up anybody or that would have caused anybody to remember this over a period of time. And it was happening over the entire area of central New Jersey. Now, that's not a huge area, but this is 1777. It's a very rural area. So people aren't knowing what's happening even 20 miles away. So a lot of it was just happened and forgotten. That's number two. No major battles that people really could focus on. And then finally, I think it was kind of between the bookmarks, so to speak, of Trenton, that was an enormously dramatic victory for the Americans. Princeton a little bit less so, but dramatic thing. And then you had, after this period, Washington's defense of Philadelphia, which was the American capital, which was also an extremely dramatic thing that caught a lot of people's attention. And what happened during this period of snow and ice and fighting, we didn't know too much about. It was just forgotten. It was just forgotten about, and nobody really took a hard look at it because there were no headlines came out of it, no major battles were fought there, and nobody, until we started adding up the casualties and adding up the engagements, didn't really realize that a lot had happened.
It was always a question in my mind that time period between, and you mentioned it, between Princeton and Brandywine, as to why Howe chose to put his entire army on ships, leave New York City, go all the way around the Eastern Shore and come up the Chesapeake to get to Philadelphia. And the book explains in great detail, and you talked about it, the 132 campaigns, the 3,300 casualties, the period of time involved, as to that hornet's nest that they stirred up in New Jersey about why he could not afford to march across, take the short route to get to Philadelphia. Given the squabbling and inability of the British High Command to work cohesively together in 1777. How would you characterize the American High Command that year?
Well, the high command, such that it was, basically was George Washington, and he had a number of officers at arm's length. And nobody until the Middlebrook establishment. He brought the army together in Middlebrook in May, late May. The army was spread all over New Jersey, central New Jersey, at various different places. I think a lot of this had to do with, again, forming a sort of early warning system, but also to better feed the men. I mean, they didn't want to forge out a particular area totally around Morristown. So they were all spread apart. And the command system, from what I saw, and I read virtually every correspondence that went from Washington's headquarters or came into it, I felt like if I'd have to do that to really get a handle on what was going on during this period of time. Washington was pretty removed, actually, from the day-to-day fighting. He would get reports of it after it had happened, but his lieutenants, in particular, somebody like maybe William Maxwell or Alexander, they had troops at different locations, and they would respond. If the British marched out of New Brunswick and they were nearby, they would gather what troops they could, be they militias or continentals or state troops, and attack. And those attacks are pretty much up to them. So the high command at Morristown was pretty much Washington trying to figure out how he was going to stay out of a major battle and hopefully the British not attack him. I think, like I said before, during the situation at Bound Brook, I think Washington learned a lot. He was open to learning. He had to learn. It's when you're losing, you don't have a lot to play games with. You have to. You are either going to win or you're going to go down. The British were in a different situation. They were fat and happy pretty much during the winter, and Washington was constantly learning. I was very impressed. I've been impressed with Washington's character as much as anything, but you can see him learning and growing as a military commander during this period of time, and you can see his lieutenants, William Maxwell and Greene, and just a number of different junior officers really growing and learning how to cooperate with one another. Unfortunately, they did not yet have the kind of army that could function in that manner. A well-trained, well-disciplined army that could fight in divisions, so to speak. But I was impressed with Washington's command and with his give and take with his top officers versus the British. Like you said, the British, I think, were just indifferent almost.
Well, we talked about a little bit about how the American way of fighting, and it starts back there, but it carries through to today. A couple of the tenets of the American military are centralized planning and decentralized execution, and the understanding of commander's intent and the allowance of people to execute within the spirit of the commander's intent. So we don't micromanage. We don't tend to micromanage in the American Army, and that seems to have been, you basically say you're finding the roots of that concept here in Washington's style of command.
Yeah, let me take that another step. I think free thinking people, you can take those people and you get the best ones, and they will be able to think their way through things. I mean, my reading of history, it was the Japanese were the same as the British. They had a command structure, and you did what you were told to do, and that's what you did. And whereas Americans fighting historically, if a captain was killed, a lieutenant took over. If the lieutenant was killed, a sergeant took over, and often the sergeant could conceive and figure out plans to follow the instructions quite well. Whereas those things tended to fall apart in the British Army. The troops weren't trained to take over and fight for themselves. They needed officers to command them. Free people, I think, ultimately make better soldiers than nobles and peasants. That's my takeaway from it, because they're trained to think. You have to think on your own.
And I think I tend to agree with you in that regard, and I think it was demonstrated throughout the period. One of the one of our questions here is other than Washington, who would you deem the most significant American officer of the New Jersey campaign? But I think when you look at Sullivan, Greene, Morgan, Maxwell, Sterling, the guys who operated and made names for themselves in the Jersey campaign, those guys went on to bigger and better things in most cases across the board. So this was where they learned a little bit of their independent thinking. But what would you, who would you say was the most significant officer to assert himself in the Jersey campaign?
I would say first and foremost, William Maxwell. Yeah. Morgan maybe secondly, but Morgan didn't get there till a little bit later. And I've written a lot about Morgan, so I'm a little bit pro Morgan to begin with. But Maxwell was an excellent soldier. I mean, his family came over, I think, from Scotland and lived in northern New Jersey. He fought in the French and Indian War as a provincial, but became a lieutenant colonel, which is no small thing. So he had some good, serious fighting ability and background. I think he did an excellent job during this period of time. He fought with a lot of innovation and aggressiveness. Washington appreciated that. When he marched towards Philadelphia in the summer, he took Maxwell and made him in command of all of his light troops that way. But I didn't really follow his career all the way through. I finished the book, but it's my understanding that he got very distraught over some complaints about what he was doing and maybe some backstabbing, and he ultimately left the Continental Army over it. I kind of get the impression that happened from time to time. People went after Washington. I know they went after Morgan, but I was impressed with Maxwell. He was a frontline soldier. The men seemed to like him, and he was very aggressive.
Yeah, he certainly made an impact. And his was one of the names that stood out to me in reading through the book, a guy that I was not very familiar with, that I actually came to really appreciate his contributions. We're getting toward the end of the line here, and I'd like to wrap up with a question, and it's sort of a specific question, but it comes from Fred Fonseca of the Pennsylvania Society. And he says, my research on my ancestor's brother, James Hamilton, indicates that while a company commander in the 1st Pennsylvania Regiment, he was captured near New Brunswick, New Jersey in November of 1777. Do you have any idea what Pennsylvania line troops were doing in New Jersey, so far away from the main army in Philadelphia? And he further states that Hamilton was young, but he was a seasoned veteran who, with his Lancaster Company of Thompson's Rifle Battalion, had marched to Cambridge in the summer of 1775.
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, I read that yesterday. And first off, I had to be honest with you. I mean, my book ends in summer, and so I really hadn't extended my research into the fall. But I decided last night, well, I got to take a look at this. And so I pulled out a lot of my references and started looking into the fall. Couldn't find much of anything. Now, I have some ideas about this. I mean, the British Army had marched off, but they still maintained New York. They still maintained the port of New York was extremely important to them. They had possession of most of the land around that, and they could easily have, in the fall of 1777, maybe sent an excursion up the Raritan River, maybe looking for more forage. It's November, maybe the hay's in the barn, maybe they're looking for some more forage. And maybe Washington had left some troops behind to sort of bolster the militias in New Jersey. I couldn't find anything about any of that. Interestingly, too, I mean, I have some pretty specific references. I went to New Brunswick. I found all sorts of fighting prior to that fall, after that fall, but I found absolutely nothing during that fall. And I looked at some of the towns around New Brunswick, because often the soldiers at the period didn't know exactly where New Brunswick was, or Brunswick was, as it was called during the period. I found absolutely no fighting whatsoever. And these references, I mean, a lot of them, well, I mean, if somebody threw a rock at a British soldier and people knew about it, it showed up in some of these things. So I really don't know what to say. it's entirely possible he was there. It's entirely possible that happened. Maybe he was checking on some sentinels or something, some guards somewhere, and happened to run into a British expedition and got gobbled up. That's entirely possible. I found nothing to that extent. Maybe it's possible too that the dates are wrong or the location's wrong. I wish I could come up with something more than that. I looked for about an hour and a half, but I couldn't find anything to show me actually any fighting at all during the fall around those areas in New Jersey. So sorry, so I can't help you out.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim. I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'll give you an opportunity to wrap up here. One of the things I found fascinating in reading the book, and not being a New Jersey native, but a guy who has been through New Jersey. When I retired from the Army, I went to work for a company out of Monmouth. So I spent a lot of time in Monmouth and Red Bank and making the trips up and down the Garden State from the airport. The names of some of the towns that you're talking about in there: Spanktown, Quibbletown, Samptown. Those are not names that are still on the New Jersey map. So can you talk a little bit about how the naming conventions and how those areas have sort of evolved? And I know one of your references in previous interviews had to do with stripping the current environment down to the ground as it looked in 1777, to take people back in time to see what New Jersey looked like back in the day. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. I mean, that's one of the things I attempted to do in this book. Was I found a New Jersey that I had no reference with. Different towns, totally agrarian, and what I wanted to do was not just write a history book per se, but write a history in which I could bring back that period of time. And so the chapters are headed by Quibbletown or Spanktown or whatever, the names that they used back then. Long ago, names have been long forgotten. I had never heard of any of them. I know Roger Williams hadn't heard of a number of them either. He got a big kick out of it. So it was to bring people back, not just to the Revolutionary War, but bring them back to a period in New Jersey that was totally different. Different towns, different places, different roads, just a totally different atmosphere, and try to present the revolution in those terms. Because to understand it right, you probably need to understand it in those terms. It was just a completely different world from ours or the New Jersey of today, and that's the way I tried to present it.
Thank you. I think it's a fascinating book. I think everybody would, if you're a student of the Revolution, or you're just a casual reader of history, I think you would enjoy The Enemy Harassed. I highly recommend it. I think it's going to become an important resource for folks that are looking to put the whole history of the war together, not just the well-known battles. Growing up in Virginia back, we were taught about the Southern Campaign and the importance of the Southern Campaign, but a lot of folks looking back on their high school and elementary school educations about the Revolutionary War only know about the battles that were fought, the big name battles. Everybody knows about Valley Forge, everybody knows about Yorktown, but very few people know the areas, those smaller campaigns and those periods in between. So this is an important effort in filling in some of those blank spots in our history, and I appreciate what you've done here. Offer up a couple of closing comments for you, and then we can wrap up here.
Yeah, sure. Not just the smaller battles or the smaller skirmishes, but the people. It was the people who won this revolution, and you could see it in New Jersey as much as any place, that the people really went to Washington's side. They got disgusted with the British and they fought the British, and the people revolted this is a revolution in New Jersey. And that's what I saw, a revolution of the people who decided they were going to throw off the oppressors, quite frankly, because that's what the British were. And it eventually moved on to freedom, and it moved on to a democratic government with a constitution and the country we have today. But it's nice to see, to go back. It wasn't just George Washington won this war. I have nothing but respect for George Washington, but the people won it for him, and he knew that he had to have the people. And you could see it during this period in New Jersey. It was an exciting thing to research and an exciting book to write. I hope people enjoy it.
Well, thank you, Jim. We appreciate your time. The Sons of the American Revolution and our 37,000 members were very appreciative of your effort here, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Brooks. Enjoyed it.